So there were three columns, commanded respectively by Crook, Terry, and Gibbon, and they were all supposed to converge and meet up together, which Terry and Gibbon did, and Crook did not, because he was down there on the Tongue River after having his battle at the Rosebud and then retreating and hoping for reinforcements. So Terry and Gibbon are there by themselves. So that's 2/3 of the force they thought they were going to have. They then proceeded westward along the Yellowstone River with the intent of, when reaching the mouth of the Bighorn River, heading southward along that until they reached the spur known as the Little Bighorn River. Terry ordered Custer and his 7th Cavalry to scout to the south along Rosebud Creek. But it was expected that the Indian encampments were to the northwest. That's why they took the largest force there. So Custer was sent to scout and report back, although he was given permission to depart from those orders if it seemed necessary. General Terry offered to send some Gatling guns along with him, which was an early version of a machine gun. But Custer said, "No thanks, that would just slow me down." So on June 22nd, the 7th Cavalry separated from Gibbon's column and headed south by southwest. The 7th Cavalry was composed of 31 officers, 566 enlisted men, and about 100 scouts, some of whom were civilian white scouts, but the majority of whom were either Arikara, which was the largest number, or Crow. So they headed along the Rosebud Creek and made camp about right here, and several of the Indian scouts continued going further southwest until they came to an overlook called the Crow's Nest that was a very high vantage point, especially for this area. And they sent word back that Custer needed to come join them as soon as possible because they had to show him something. So the following morning, he came out through there. He met with them. What is it? And they said, well, about 15 miles west of here, we see we can see a village, a huge village, the biggest village we've ever seen. There's got to be 2,000 or 3,000 people there. Custer couldn't see anything. Neither could the white scouts. The Indian scouts had then told him, by the way, while we're on the subject, if we look to the other direction about 15 miles, we can clearly see the smoke from your campfire, and we can tell how many people are there. And if we can do that, so can the Indians in that huge village. Well, Custer may have believed that there could be a village there, but the idea that it could be so large was just, to him, ridiculous, because all the reports that he had received and that Gibbon and Terry had received was that there were no more than 800 hostiles in the area. That's what the Indian agents had reported. They got that number because that's about how many were off, quote unquote, off of the reservation with Sitting Bull when all this had started back in the winter. When they had been told that Sitting Bull's band and the others needed to come in at once. And there were about 800 of them out there. That failed to take into account all the Cheyenne that had joined them. And it failed to take into account the large number of Lakotas on the reservation who had left in the spring and gone and joined them. Also failed to take into account what his own scouts were telling him. The civilian scouts, the white guys, they couldn't see the same things that the Indians saw, but they trusted them. In fact, they told Custer, "Listen, I have never heard of a village this big, and they know what they're talking about." Custer, however, was not convinced. He did, however, decide that they needed to take some action. So the rest of the regiment caught up to the scouts, then realized that they had left some of their food supplies behind, so a detachment was sent back to their previous location to gather those, only to discover that in the short time since they had left, um, Indian pony tracks indicated that some natives had been there and had taken the food. In fact, it turns out this was a Cheyenne group led by Little Wolf. Well, that caused Custer some concern because he was fearful that this group, which was a small group, he wasn't fearful that they would attack, but rather that they would warn the others before the 7th Cavalry could get to them. So they stepped up their pace and headed west along what would later be known as Reno Creek, named after Custer's second in command. So I guess that's a good segue to mention some of the other people who were along aside from Lieutenant Colonel Custer. His second in command was Major Marcus Reno, and his third in command was Captain Frederick Benteen. There was another captain who was somewhat prominent in the action that took place after this that I don't have pictured here, Captain Miles Keogh, originally from Ireland. I do have pictured Captain Thomas Custer, George Custer's little brother, the one with 2 medals of honor. Also along was their even younger brother, Boston Custer, who was 27 years old, and their even younger nephew, Henry Armstrong Reed, alias Audie Reed, who was 18. Boston and Audie weren't even in the Army. They were among that number of civilian scouts. They also were classified as packers, foragers, guides, civilian contractors, which essentially you could argue they were basically hangers on because the whole Custer clan was here. Audie, by the way, was the son of the 3 brothers' sister. So, anyway, back to the story. After they went west about another 2.5 miles, they found a lone teepee with a dead Indian in it, which was actually a Sanzark Lakota warrior who had been mortally wounded a few days before fighting against General Crook's command at the Battle of the Rosebud. This had been the location of the village at that time. He had made it back to the village and had subsequently died in his own teepee. So when they picked up, the rest of them picked up their teepees and packed them up and headed on. Out of respect, they left his standing and left him there in it as his resting place. Of course, Custer's men had no way of knowing exactly what this was, but it must have been awfully darn spooky. Just a little bit past the lone teepee, when they were still 12 miles from the Little Bighorn River, Custer divided his regiment into 3 battalions. Now, he had 12 companies altogether. He assigned 3 companies to Reno, 3 companies to Benteen, and he took 5 companies, which left 1 other company that was left there at that spot to guard and protect the pack train. So there was going to be a 3-pronged attack against the village. The idea was that Reno would take his 3 companies and he would hit the village on the left bank of the river, on the west bank of the river, hit the southwest corner of the village. Custer would continue on up the river and cross it and come right into the middle of the village. And Benteen and his 3 companies were meant to be coming up from the southeast so that they could catch anybody that got away. This was the same basic. These were the same tactics Custer had used 8 years earlier at the Battle of the Washita, alias the Washita Massacre in Oklahoma, against the Cheyenne. The idea being that anytime you get an opportunity to attack a village, do so. The more women and children are there, the better, because the warriors will retreat because they won't want to fight and endanger their family. Then you can capture the women and children and use them as hostages to try to get the warriors to surrender. So that was the plan, and that plan worked pretty well against a mostly peaceful Cheyenne village that had very few warriors in it. Turns out this was going to be a little bit different. I've decided to include what I think may be a direct quote, although translated, from one of the Crow scouts. Or words to that effect. In fact, one Crow scout did say, when translated, "We're all going to be going home today on a road that we're not used to," which is, a more poetic way of saying just that, what I wrote down there. Some of them began singing their death song because, from their perspective, this was not looking very good. Reno crossed the river and formed a skirmish line there in purple and started firing into the village, which he was only seeing the edge of it. He couldn't really see just how big it was, but he did immediately notice a whole great big bunch of Lakota and Cheyenne attacking him. So he was forced to fall back across the river on several different occasions, trying to put up some resistance, but basically retreating until he reached a hill there where his men entrenched, there where it says entrenchment. This hill is now called Reno Hill, and by entrenching, that means that they took out their knives or their tin plates or whatever they could find and dug in the dirt to get some cover and some protection. Benteen heard the shooting, and he rode to the west and came upon Reno on his hill and reinforced him there. As they were fighting, as the entrenchment was just beginning before Benteen got there, I believe that was the order. Bloody Knife, who had been with Reno's battalion, was shot in the head right next to Major Reno, splattered all over him. Some people say that kind of unnerved him a little bit, but they were there taking heavy casualties, and they heard a lot of gunfire coming from a little farther to the west. And all the Indians left them eventually and headed westward to join that party. And that, of course, was Custer's battalion. He had 210 men total, including all of his relatives who were along, and a reporter or two, I believe. And so they had proceeded on down the river a couple of miles. And then the fact they could proceed down the river a couple of miles and were still near the village should tell you something. Then he was going to proceed according to plan and charge right into the middle of the village, thinking that everyone would scatter, but they didn't scatter. In fact, by most accounts, he didn't make it across the river at all until he started to be overwhelmed with Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces. And he, too, was forced to fall back, taking very heavy losses all along the way until, like Reno, he made his way to a hill with those men who were still surviving from his command. And that's where, well, it's called Last Stand Hill. So that tells you how that one turned out. There was one horse named Comanche that was the only survivor of Custer's entire battalion there. Custer died with a bullet to the chest, and he also had a post-mortem bullet wound to the head. Native witnesses say that some of the soldiers shot themselves in the head to avoid even the chance of capture and torture. They were all dead by late afternoon, and then the warriors were able to turn their attention once more to Reno and Benteen, and that fighting on the Reno Hill continued until 9 p.m. that night, when finally it was too dark to kill more white people, I guess. And so that was an end to the fighting for then. And then afterward, Terry's column finally reached, coming from the other direction, and the Indians then moved on. The field was strewn with white bodies, which had all been stripped, scalped, mutilated. Altogether, there were 268 dead. 210 of those were Custer and his entire 5 companies. That means there were 58 killed from among Benton and Reno's group, and there was a further 55 that were wounded, 6 of whom died shortly thereafter of their wounds. 2 out of the 3 surgeons were killed. The Lakota called this battle the Battle of the Greasy Grass, which was their name for the river that the whites called the Little Bighorn. And it was a huge victory for them, and they celebrated afterward uninterrupted for most of the month of July. The rest of the country, not so much. This happened on June 25th. By the time word got back and the presses rolled and people were getting their newspapers and finding out about this, it was around the time of the 4th of July, Independence Day, July the 4th, 1876, which means not just any 4th of July. It was the centennial. It was the 100th birthday of America. And around that time, Americans were finding out that the greatest American hero had just been massacred by Indians. There was, of course, a national outcry for revenge, and the forces that would now be brought against the tribes of the Northern Plains would be much, much greater than they already were, much more determined and much more vengeful.